All right, so a little update of what we've been doing in the garage lately. See, we got the Nova up on the lift. Got the headers out, redoing the exhaust to kind of tighten things up, fix some leaks so that the sensors will be more accurate. Give you guys. So here's the header with new wrapping. Mainly what I did, like you see on this header, this one's not wrapped yet. So I triangulated this to get a little bit more flow. And then I had to block out the surface here where it mounts to the engine to make everything perfectly flat so the gaskets will seal properly. One of them was leaking on the inside here. I had to weld this up and then grind it back down. It had a crack in it or something. Air was getting in and exhaust was getting out, making the sensor not read properly. And then redid the exhaust pipes, which you can kind of see here. Yeah, so she's apart, but hopefully the idea is to make the exhaust as airtight as possible. Now it's going to use gaskets. So this kind of flange that I made here, there's a receiver flange on the actual exhaust that matches it, so they'll bolt together. And then I made these gaskets out of exhaust material. And these will go in there, so now it's gasketed to seal the exhaust up to make it more accurate. This is one header that's done, all wrapped up. Next, I gotta wrap that one. Very tedious project. Stuff, even though it's titanium, it's kind of like fiberglass. That's why I got the mask. You gotta, fibers get everywhere, so you gotta protect your lungs. And it's really itchy. You gotta have gloves, long sleeves, cover as much as possible. I don't really like the stuff handling it, especially on the car when you're changing plugs and whatnot. It seems like these fibers get everywhere, but it does do a really good job of keeping the heat in, which if I don't have it, then what ends up happening is the fiberglass fenders up there get so hot that the paint will bubble off, and we don't want that. So we got to keep that heat in the headers. And that's the project. Get the exhaust all back together, get this car up and running. I had pulled the whole front end apart. I had the blower out, had the pulley off, found a couple interesting things there. Apparently the crank wasn't double keywayed, which is two notches in the crank that the balancer goes into, and has two pieces of metal that keeps it from spinning because of all the pressures that you get on this blower pulley, because it's got to spin the blower. It takes a lot of horsepower to do that, so there's a lot of stress on that. So you have to double keyway the crank to the balancer. So that was an issue. It wasn't double keywayed. It ended up breaking the keyway, the single keyway, and it spun a little bit on the crank, which threw the timing off, which made it a little difficult for me to tune. I was trying to figure out why things changed. It was because the timing that I was looking at wasn't the accurate timing, because the balancer had spun on the crank, so it wasn't lined up right. And then I found some bolts that go through the lower pulley here, where the blower pulley mounts to the balancer. The bolts that go through there and this mandrel were actually a little bit too short. So there's a spacer in there about 1/4 of an inch for the, what do you want to call it? I don't know. Draw the blank. For your crank trigger. All right, let me get my mind thoughts together. I got so many things going on at once. So the crank trigger here, show you guys a picture. That monitors the position of the crank. And you got this little 1/4-inch spacer here that's got the magnets on it. So that takes up some space. So when the bolts go through into the balancer, you gotta figure for that. And you gotta have a long enough bolt to go through that into the balancer and catch a good amount of threads, which is like almost 1/2 inch worth of threads. So in my case, I only had like maybe 2 threads grabbing. So one of them actually stripped, and the pulley was actually walking a little bit on the balancer, which ain't good. If I ever really got a full hit on this car, it probably would have broke and destroyed everything on the front of this engine. So kind of luckily we've been working out problems and that didn't happen. The other thing that we had to fix, we pulled the transmission out, which is over here. And it turns out that there's supposed to be restrictors, oil restrictors in the back of the block. They go back here, and what it does is it keeps the oil pump from pumping all the oil up to the valve covers and not getting enough oil back to the pan to keep the motor, the crank and the rods oiled. So on this particular block, this is a Merlin 3 block, and it requires restrictors. And then you can figure out through tuning what size they need to be so that you're getting enough oil for your crank and rods, you're getting enough oil up to the valve covers for your rockers and your lifters, but you're not just pumping the pan completely dry, which was kind of what was happening. It was pumping so much oil out of the pan that when you stepped on the brake, the little bit of oil that was left in this pan would rush forward and the pickup would starve for oil, and then the whole motor doesn't get oil because it's all up in the valve covers. So definitely not good. I had to fix that. Yeah, so a couple things like that. So now that that's all resolved and I get this exhaust tightened up, what I'm thinking is going to happen is now my sensors will be more accurate. I'll be able to tune a little bit better, which we're really close. Just drivability stuff I've been messing with, mainly when we transition from normal driving and then you start to get into boost. It really wants a lot of fuel right there. So that's where I'm kind of figuring out where the sweet spot is in the tune. And that's pretty much it. So I'm going to keep working on this, get these headers tightened up, get everything back together, and then we'll be back to tuning and testing and seeing that this exhaust works and solves my issue with leaks in the exhaust. So then the sensors should be more accurate. So that's Ron Westner still in the garage playing with the Nova, trying to get it ready so that hopefully this spring we'll be able to make a hit with this car and get some numbers on it. So for now, I'll catch you guys later. Bye.